She was 56 years old, carrying one suitcase, and the man waiting on the platform looked like he'd rather face a blizzard than her. This is the story of Caleb Voss, a rancher who believed love was something that happened to younger men, and Margaret Ellison, the widow who arrived on the last train into Red Hollow, Montana, and turned everything he thought he knew about survival completely upside down. Before we begin, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and become part of our family. Don't miss a single story and drop a like. Then tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from tonight? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to stay with you. The snow had been falling since noon and showed no intention of stopping. Caleb Voss stood beneath the overhang of the Red Hollow platform with his collar turned up against the wind and his boots already soaked through from the walk across the yard. The station lantern above him swung on its hook, throwing light in uneven arcs across the wooden planks, and the whole structure groaned under the weight of the drifts piling up along its edges. He'd been standing there 40 minutes. He knew because he'd checked his pocket watch 4 times. Not because he was eager, but because he was trying to calculate exactly how much longer this was going to take. The 7:15 out of Billings was late. Of course it was. He shifted his weight and looked down the track. Nothing but darkness and the sound of wind scraping dead branches against the side of the station house. There was one other person waiting, old Amos Greer, the station master, who'd worked this platform since before the war and moved with the slow deliberateness of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything years ago. He sat inside his booth with a lantern and a cup of something that had long since gone cold, turning the pages of a newspaper he'd probably already read twice. Caleb didn't speak to him. He wasn't there for conversation. He was there because 4 months ago, after 2 winters so bad he'd lost 14 head of cattle and nearly his left hand to frostbite, he'd written a letter to a matrimonial agency in Chicago. The kind of letter a man writes when he's out of options and too proud to admit it even to himself. He'd been careful with his words. He'd described his land, 200 acres on the eastern slope of the Bitterroot Range, a working cattle operation, a solid cabin, a root cellar with enough provisions to last 3 seasons. He'd listed what he needed: someone capable of hard work, someone who understood frontier life, someone who wouldn't expect warmth from a man who had forgotten how to produce it. He had not mentioned loneliness anywhere in the letter. That wasn't a word he used. The agency had written back with a name: Margaret Ellison, widow, Oregon. They'd exchanged 3 letters over the course of a month and a half. Careful, practical letters, nothing that could be mistaken for sentiment. She'd asked him about the water source, the nearest doctor, the condition of the wood stove. He'd answered honestly. She had not asked about his feelings. He had not offered them. It had seemed like the beginning of a sensible arrangement. He had not asked for her age. He supposed that was an oversight. The whistle came first, distant and then rapidly closer, and Caleb straightened up and moved to the edge of the platform. The locomotive came around the bend with its headlamp cutting through the dark, and the brakes began their long, grinding complaint as it slowed along the approach. Steam billowed out across the platform, and for a moment Caleb couldn't see anything at all, just white, rolling clouds of vapor and the yellow glow of the windows sliding past him. The train stopped. A porter stepped down from one of the cars and set a small step on the ground. Caleb watched the windows. He watched the doors. He was expecting. He wasn't entirely sure what he was expecting. Someone younger, maybe. Not young, he told himself. He wasn't a fool about that, but younger than 56. The agency hadn't said 56. He found that out when he opened her last letter, and she'd written, almost as an aside, that she hoped her age would not be a point of difficulty, as she had found that men in the West often had expectations that women of her years were not inclined to pretend to meet. He'd read that sentence twice and said nothing about it in his reply. The porter helped one passenger off, just the one. She came down carefully, one hand on the rail, not because she was frail, but because the step was icy and she was being sensible about it. She was wearing a dark coat, wool, practical, worn at the elbows, and a hat that had clearly been brushed clean but was many seasons old. She carried a single suitcase in her right hand, a brown leather bag with a brass clasp that caught the light as she straightened up on the platform and looked around. She was not what he'd imagined. But then, he suspected he was not what she'd imagined either. Her hair was silver going on white, pinned up under the hat. She had the kind of face that had never been conventionally beautiful, but had become interesting over time. Deep-set eyes, a jaw that suggested someone who didn't back down easily, lines around her mouth that could have come from grief or from stubbornness or from both. She wasn't small. She stood with a straight back and scanned the platform with the focused look of someone doing an inventory, not someone arriving in hope. Their eyes met. Neither of them smiled. Caleb walked over. He stopped a few feet from her because he wasn't sure what the appropriate distance was for this kind of meeting, and neither apparently was she, because she didn't step forward either. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. "Mr. Voss," she said. There was a pause that lasted about 3 seconds too long. "Train was late," he said. "There was ice on the track outside of Missoula," she said. "They slowed for most of the last 40 miles. You eat?" "On the train. An hour ago." He nodded. He reached out for her suitcase, and she hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, the way someone does when they're not sure whether to accept help or interpret it as commentary on their ability to manage. And then let him take it. It was heavier than it looked. He didn't say so. "Wagon's out front," he said. "It's a 2-hour ride to the ranch. Could be more in this snow." "I've ridden in worse," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "Oregon winters aren't like Montana winters." "No," she agreed. "They're not. But I didn't say they were." He looked at her for a moment. Something in the way she said it, not defensive, not apologetic, just precise, made him recalibrate slightly. He turned and led the way off the platform, and she followed without comment. The wagon ride was, as he'd predicted, close to 2.5 hours. The snow came down steadily, not heavy enough to make the road impassable, but consistent enough to be annoying, and the wind off the mountains had a particular viciousness to it that seemed personal. Caleb kept the horses at a careful pace, and Margaret sat beside him on the bench with a blanket across her lap that she'd pulled from the back without being told. She didn't complain about the cold. She didn't say much of anything. She looked at the landscape, what little of it was visible in the dark, with the same measuring attention she'd used on the platform. About 30 minutes in, she asked, "What happened to your hand?" He looked at his left hand on the reins. Even with the glove on, the way 2 of his fingers sat wasn't right. "Frostbite, two winters back, lost some of the feeling in them." "Do they ache in the cold?" "Yes." "There's a poultice made with pine resin and tallow," she said. "It doesn't fix the damage, but it helps with the aching. I can put it together once we're settled." He didn't know what to do with that. He said, "That's not necessary." "I know it's not necessary," she said. "I offered anyway." Another long silence. "I should tell you some things about the ranch before we get there," he said eventually, "since I didn't put everything in the letters." "All right." "The cabin has 2 rooms. I'll take the back room. The front room has the wood stove and the table and a cot I've set up. It's not fancy." "I didn't expect fancy. The nearest town is Red Hollow. That's where we came through. It's about 12 miles. The nearest doctor is in Harlan, which is 22 miles in good weather. In bad weather, you don't go to the doctor. You manage." "I've managed without a doctor before." He glanced at her again. "There are things that need doing every day without exception. The animals don't care about weather or how you feel. The well can freeze if you're not careful about it. The root cellar needs checking every few days in winter because the moisture can spoil the stores." "I understand," she said. "I'm not saying these things to scare you." "I know you're not," she said. "You're saying them so that when things get hard, I can't claim I wasn't warned. It's a reasonable thing to do." He turned that over in his mind. "Yes," he said finally. "That's about right." She nodded, looking straight ahead at the dark and the snow. "I should probably tell you things too," she said, "in the interest of being fair." "Go ahead." "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I have opinions and I state them. I don't pretend to agree when I don't. My late husband thought that was one of my worst qualities. I've decided since then that it's not something I'm going to apologize for anymore." "I don't need agreement," Caleb said. "I need someone who can do the work." "I can do the work," she said. "I've never in my adult life failed to do the work in front of me." "All right." "I also sleep lightly and wake before dawn. I'll want a corner of the shelf for my own things. And I won't tolerate being spoken to as though I'm a nuisance, even if it's been a long day and you're tired. I've had that life. I'm not going back to it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. The horses moved through the dark. "I'm not a cruel man," he said. "I'm a private one. There's a difference." "Yes," she said, "there is." He wasn't sure if that meant she believed him or simply acknowledged the distinction. He didn't ask. The ranch came into view through the trees as a dark shape against the white. The cabin, the barn, the fence lines barely visible in the blowing snow. Caleb had left a lamp burning inside, which he rarely did, though he wasn't going to explain why he'd done it tonight. He pulled the team to a stop in front of the barn and climbed down stiffly. His back had been giving him trouble since the previous summer, a thing he'd said nothing about in his letters either. Margaret climbed down on her own before he could come around to help, which he noticed, and he thought about saying something and decided not to. They put the horses up together. She moved around the animals without nervousness, checking their hooves after the icy road, refilling the water without being asked. He watched her sideways while pretending to do other things. "You've worked horses before," he said. "My husband's operation ran 40 horses at its peak," she said. "I didn't just manage the books." "You managed books?" He hadn't known that. "For 16 years," she said. "Contracts, records, shipment agreements, whatever needed doing." He filed that away and said nothing. Inside the cabin, he lit the overhead lantern and showed her the space. It was what he'd told her. Plain, clean, functional, and cold in the way that places get cold when no one has been living in them warmly for a long time. The furniture was heavy and old, the curtains were faded from a decade of sun and weather, and the wood stove, though well made, needed a new seal around the door that he'd been meaning to replace since October. Margaret set her suitcase on the cot and looked around. "I can have it warmer in here in 20 minutes, she said. "The wood's in the box by the stove." "I see it." She took off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door without being shown where the hooks were. She crouched by the wood stove and opened the door and looked at the damper position and adjusted it before laying the fire. She worked quickly and without drama and had the thing burning properly in about the time she'd promised. Caleb stood in the doorway between the front room and the back and watched. "You want coffee?" she asked, not looking up. "There's a pot on the shelf," he said. "I see that too." He leaned against the doorframe. He didn't leave. He didn't come further in, either. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. "Margaret," she said. "We're married. That's enough formality." "Margaret," he said, and the word felt strange in his mouth, personal in a way he hadn't expected. "I want to be honest with you about something." She looked up at him. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I've been alone a long time. I know how to run a ranch, and I know how to get through a winter, but I'm not sure I know how to share a space with another person anymore. I wanted you to know that so you don't think the difficulty comes from something else." She held his gaze for a moment. "I know how to share a space," she said. "I'll manage both our portions until you remember how." He didn't know what to say to that, so he nodded and went to the back room and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark for a while, listening to the wind outside and the sound of someone moving around in his kitchen for the first time in longer than he cared to count. In the days that followed, Caleb watched. He told himself it wasn't watching exactly. He told himself it was simply the natural attention a man pays to a new element in his operation. You assess it, you figure out how it fits, you determine what adjustments need to be made. That was all it was. But he watched. He watched her wake before he did each morning, which he hadn't expected. He'd imagined he'd be breaking her into the early hours, the 4 a.m. starts, the requirement to be moving before any light touched the sky. Instead, he came out of the back room the second morning to find her already at the stove, coffee made, the lamps trimmed, the water pulled from the well, which meant she'd gone outside in the dark and the cold alone, which meant she'd done it without complaint or ceremony or any apparent expectation of acknowledgement. He sat down and drank the coffee and said, "You don't have to do the water on your own." "I was up," she said. It made sense. "The well rope frays in cold weather," he said. "You have to feed it carefully or it'll break on you mid-pull. I should have told you that." "I noticed," she said. "I was careful." He drank more coffee. Outside, the light was starting to come up, thin and gray through the window glass. "How'd you sleep?" "Fine," she said, and the way she said it made him think it wasn't entirely true, but also that she wasn't going to make it his problem. He nodded. 3 days in, he came back from the barn at midday and stopped in the doorway of the cabin. Something was different. He stood there for a moment trying to identify it, and then he realized the curtains were down. Both windows were bare, which he thought for a moment meant she'd removed them in some kind of protest, but then he looked across the room and saw them folded on the table with a needle and thread beside them. "They were torn," she said from behind him. She was coming in from outside carrying a bundle of dry herbs from somewhere, something she'd apparently found growing near the fence line or brought from her suitcase. "The hems were coming apart, and there were 2 holes where the rings had worn through the fabric. I'm repairing them." "They've been like that for a while," he said. "I know," she said. "I can tell." He moved out of the doorway, and she came inside and set the herbs on the shelf near the window. He looked at the curtains on the table and thought about the fact that he'd been walking past those torn curtains for 2 years without doing anything about them. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know I didn't have to," she said. "I wanted to." He went to the hook for his work coat and kept his back to her. "What are the herbs for?" "Some of them are for cooking. The gray ones are for the poultice I mentioned, for your hand." He turned around. "You don't have to. You're favoring that hand when you work," she said, not unkindly. "I've seen you do it 3 times this morning when you didn't think I was looking. It's slowing you down, and if it's hurting, you're managing something you don't need to manage." She paused. "Sit down tonight and let me put it on. It'll take 10 minutes and it'll help. You can argue with me about it if you want, but that's what's going to happen regardless." Caleb looked at her. She looked back at him with an expression that was utterly without aggression. She wasn't challenging him. She wasn't testing him. She was simply describing the situation as she saw it, as if it were obvious, as if the only question was whether he was going to be reasonable about it. He put on his coat. "I'll be back from the barn at 4, he said. "I'll have it ready," she said. He went out into the cold and stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the sky. The clouds were coming back in from the north. More snow before nightfall, most likely. He had 30 things to get done before dark and a full week of hard weather coming, and a woman in his cabin who had, in 3 days, repaired his curtains, reorganized his supply shelf, established herself as the first person up every morning, and informed him that she was going to tend to his frostbitten hand whether he liked it or not. He walked to the barn. He didn't know what to do about her yet, but he was starting to think she might not be what he'd expected in any way he'd been prepared for. The winter deepened. By the second week of December, the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that made the nails in the cabin walls contract and pop in the night, a sound like distant gunshots that would have startled anyone not accustomed to mountain winters. Margaret didn't startle at it. She'd simply lie still in the dark for a moment, take stock of the cabin sounds, and go back to sleep. Caleb knew this because the walls were thin, and he was a light sleeper, and he paid more attention to the sounds of the front room than he would have admitted. She'd hung the curtains back up after repairing them, and they were level now in a way they'd never been before, and he found himself noticing that every time he looked at the windows. One evening, about 10 days after her arrival, he came inside later than usual. A section of fence on the north pasture had come down in the wind, and he'd spent 2 hours in near dark getting it temporary braced before the cattle could push through to the road. He was cold in the bone-deep way that takes hours to unwind from, and his hand ached badly in the way it only did when the temperature dropped past a certain point. He pushed the cabin door open, and the warmth hit him like something physical. There was a fire going that was clearly more thoughtfully built than the standard get-through-the-night version. The wood arranged for long, steady heat rather than quick flame. A pot on the stove that smelled like it had actual substance to it, not just the kind of base broth he'd been feeding himself all autumn. And on the table, his cup, already poured, sitting where he always sat. Margaret was mending something by the lamp, a piece of harness leather by the look of it, working a needle through the cracked section with careful, steady pulls. She looked up when he came in. "Fence come down?" she asked. "North pasture," he said. He sat down heavily in his chair. "Coffee's hot," she said, which was unnecessary since the cup was right in front of him, and he understood after a moment that she was just filling the silence, the way people do when they're giving someone room to recover without making a production of it. He wrapped both hands around the cup. The warmth went up through his palms. "That smells like real food," he said. "Venison and root vegetables," she said. "I found the last of the dried venison in the back of the cellar. It needed using before the moisture got to it." "I didn't tell you where the cellar stores were." "No," she said, and went back to the leather. He sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind was doing what wind did in December in Montana, which was to say it was attempting to remove the cabin from the landscape by force. Inside, the fire snapped quietly, and Margaret pulled her needle through the leather with the focused patience of someone who had been doing practical work their whole life, and didn't need any particular audience for it. "How'd you learn to do harness repair?" he asked. "Same ranch where I learned everything else," she said. "When you don't have money to pay someone, you learn." "How long were you on the Oregon property?" She considered. 23 years. Came out with my husband when I was 32. He died 4 years ago." "What was he like?" He didn't know why he asked that. She was quiet for a moment. "Hard-working," she said finally. "Not unkind, but not present, I suppose, is the word. He was there, but you could never quite reach him, like talking through a window." She paused. "We didn't have children. I think that made it lonelier than it might have been otherwise. He didn't offer anything in return. He wasn't ready to trade histories yet, but she didn't seem to expect it. "You've been alone a long time," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said. "How long?" He turned the cup in his hands. "My wife passed 11 years ago. My son, I had a son. He was working a drive up near the Canadian border. There was an accident. That was 8 years ago." Margaret set down the harness leather. "I'm sorry," she said. Just that. Not followed up with anything, not patted or softened. Just the 2 words said plainly, and then left alone. It was, he found, the exactly right thing. He looked at the fire for a while. The wind pressed against the cabin walls. Outside, the cattle were in the barn where he'd moved them 2 days ago, when the forecast looked serious. Everything that needed doing was done. And in the cabin, for the first time in years that he couldn't precisely count, there was a lamp lit and food on the stove and someone sitting at the same table. It wasn't love. He was 53 years old, and he'd had love and lost it, and he was not a man who confused warmth with romance. But it was something, some quality he didn't have a name for. The simple animal comfort of not being the only one in the room. He didn't say that. He drank his coffee and asked about the fence situation in the lower pasture, and she told him what she'd observed from the barnyard that afternoon, precise and practical. And they talked for a while about the ranch in the way 2 people talk when they're learning the same piece of land together. The fire burned down slowly. Neither of them rushed to go to bed. The poultice worked. Caleb wouldn't have said that out loud to Margaret, not in those exact words, because saying it out loud would require acknowledging that he'd been wrong to resist it, and he wasn't quite ready to hand her that. But 3 mornings after she'd pressed the pine resin mixture into the joints of his damaged fingers and wrapped the whole thing in a strip of clean wool cloth, he woke up and flexed his hand, and the ache that had been a constant low presence since the previous winter was not gone exactly, but quieter. Dialed down to something manageable rather than something he was always working around. He came out of the back room, and Margaret was already at the stove, same as every morning, and she looked at his hand and then looked back at the pot she was stirring and said nothing. She didn't ask how it felt. She didn't wait for a thank you. She just moved the coffee cup to where he'd sit and went back to what she was doing. He sat down. "Hand's better," he said. "Good," she said. That was the whole of it. He drank his coffee and looked out the window at the morning. The snow from the week before had settled into a hard crust that caught the early light and threw it back in pieces, and the barn roof had a 3-inch layer of white that would need to come off before the next storm, or the weight would be a problem. There were a dozen things requiring attention before noon. He ran through them in his head the way he did every morning, ticking off the order, assigning priorities. "The curtains look even," he said, not looking away from the window. Margaret was quiet for a moment. They were hanging crooked before. The left rod bracket was set 1/2 inch lower than the right. "I know," he said. "I hung them." "I moved the bracket," she said. "I should have asked first." He turned to look at her. She was still at the stove, her back mostly to him, and the set of her shoulders was neutral, not apologetic, but not dismissive either, like someone who'd done what needed doing and was prepared to have a conversation about it if he wanted to. "It's fine," he said. "I'll ask before I change things," she said. "Going forward." "You don't need to ask about curtain brackets," he said. She turned around and looked at him with a slightly narrowed expression, like she was determining whether that was permission or just practicality. "All right," she said. January came in hard, the way it always did in Red Hollow, with a week of temperatures that turned the world outside into something hostile and still. The kind of cold that makes animals stand with their backs to the wind and their eyes half closed, enduring. Caleb moved the remaining cattle to the covered section of the barn and cut his daily rounds shorter by necessity. You didn't linger outside when the air itself was trying to damage you. Margaret adapted to the confinement of those days without the restlessness Caleb had half expected. She wasn't a woman who needed entertaining. She moved through the cabin with a kind of purposeful economy, finding things that needed doing and doing them with the same steady attention she brought to everything. She recaulked the gap under the back door where the draft came through. She sorted the root cellar stores and rotated the ones closest to spoiling forward, a thing Caleb had been meaning to do since November. She found a crack in the chinking between two logs on the north wall that was letting cold air seep in and patched it with a mixture she made herself from ash and clay and something she called bear grease that she'd apparently brought from Oregon in a tin. One morning, Caleb came in from checking the barn to find she'd rearranged the supply shelf. He stood in front of it for a moment. "I can put it back," she said from across the room without looking up from what she was doing. "No," he said, studying the arrangement. She'd moved things by frequency of use rather than by size. The things he reached for every day were at eye level. The seasonal items were up high. The medical supplies were together in one place instead of scattered across 3 shelves. It was objectively more sensible. "It's better this way." "I thought it might be," she said. He hung up his coat. "You reorganized my wife's kitchen." He heard her stop what she was doing. "I'm sorry," she said, and this time it was different, quieter. Careful. "I didn't think about it that way." He kept his back to her for a moment. The word wife sat in the room between them, heavier than he'd expected when it came out. He hadn't meant it as an accusation. He wasn't even sure he'd meant it as anything. It had just come out, the way things do sometimes when you're not paying attention. It's fine," he said. He turned around. "Claire's been gone 11 years. It's a shelf." Margaret looked at him steadily. "It's not just a shelf," she said, "and you know that." He did know it. He also knew that she wasn't wrong to change it, and that the fact it bothered him for a half second said more about him than about her. He went to the table and sat down. "She would have done the same thing," he said after a moment. "Reorganized it right away. She had opinions about kitchen organization." "Most women do," Margaret said. "She had opinions about most things," he said. He wasn't sure why he was talking about this. He hadn't talked about Clara to anyone in years. "Stubborn about certain things. Softer than she looked about others." Margaret came and sat across from him. Not close. There was still the full width of the table between them. But she sat down, which meant she was staying for the conversation instead of letting him have it at the walls. "How old were you when you married her?" she asked. 28, he said. "She was 24. We had 20 years. "That's a good long time." "It was," he said. They sat with that. The fire made its sounds. Outside, the wind was a low, constant complaint. "My husband's name was Edmund," Margaret said. She said it like she was returning something he'd offered. 1 piece for 1 piece. "We had 23 years. He wasn't a bad man. He treated the marriage like a business arrangement he'd entered into and was keeping up his end of. There's nothing cruel about that exactly. But there's nothing warm about it either." Caleb looked at her. "You were lonely," he said. "For most of 23 years, she said. "Yes." There was nothing he could say to that, so he didn't try. He got up and went to the stove and poured them both more coffee and set her cup in front of her and went back to his chair. She wrapped both hands around the cup. He did the same. By the middle of January, without either of them deciding it, they'd settled into a rhythm. It wasn't a gentle thing. There were mornings when Caleb was short with her because his back had been bad in the night and he hadn't slept, and she'd hand him his coffee without comment and give him space until he'd been outside for half an hour and the cold air had worked some of the irritability out of him. There were evenings when she was quiet in a way that felt thick, like the silence had weight to it, and he'd learned to recognize that she was working through something private and that the right response was to stay in the room, but not to push. They disagreed about things. He thought she was being overly cautious about the east pasture fence. When the temperature rose slightly in the third week of January, he wanted to get out and do a proper repair. She pointed out that the forecast showed another cold front 2 days out, and they'd be doing the work twice. He said he'd rather do it twice than leave it. She said that was the stubbornness talking and not the sense. He went out and did the repair. The cold front came in 2 days later. 12 hours after that, a section of the repair gave way in the wind, and he had to go back out in worse conditions than the first time to fix it again. He came back inside, and she didn't say anything. She gave him dry clothes and hot food and moved on. 2 days later, he said, "You were right about the fence." "I know," she said. "You could say you told me so." "I could," she said. "What would be the point?" He thought about that. "It would be satisfying." "For about 30 seconds," she said, "and then we'd still have the same fence." He almost laughed. He caught it before it came out, but she saw it anyway, saw something shift in his face. And she turned back to what she was doing with a small, private expression that wasn't quite a smile but was in that direction. He realized afterward that it was the closest he'd come to laughing in something like 2 years. Red Hollow was the kind of small town that ran on observation. 12 miles from the ranch was close enough that Caleb needed to make supply runs about twice a month. And after Margaret's arrival, he started bringing her along. Not out of obligation, so she didn't ask to come. And he didn't offer out of any particular sense of sociability. It was practical. She knew what supplies they needed better than he did at this point, and she was more systematic about it. The first time they came into town together, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Caleb noticed the looking. He'd lived in Red Hollow long enough to know how it worked. People watched. They took stock. They made assessments about other people's situations and held them like currency to trade over fences and across counters. He'd been the subject of it himself after Clara died. That particular quality of attention that towns give to their widowed members. Equal parts sympathy and curiosity, and the slightly uncomfortable relief of knowing it wasn't you. Now the attention had a different character. At Greeley's supply store, Hector Greeley made a point of introducing himself to Margaret with the particular warmth of a man who's been waiting to get a look at something. He was pleasant enough about it. Asked where she was from, said he hoped she was finding the climate manageable, made a small joke about Montana winters that he told to every newcomer. Margaret responded to all of it with polite precision, answered his questions without elaborating, and then turned to the supply list. Efficient, not rude, just not interested in performing for the audience. In the street afterward, walking to the wagon, Caleb said, "Greeley's harmless." "I know he is," she said. "I've met 100 men like him. Friendly, curious, and they'll have told their version of what you're like to half the town before you've made it to the edge of the road." Caleb glanced at her. "That bother you?" "People talk," she said. "I've been talked about before." He thought about asking what she'd been talked about for, and then decided that was a question for another time. He helped her up to the wagon seat. She accepted this one without hesitation, which he noticed, and they headed back toward the ranch. About a mile out of town, she said, "A woman named—" she introduced herself as Dora Fletcher, "stopped me near the dry goods counter while you were talking to the hardware man." "Dora Fletcher," he said. "What did she want?" "She wanted to know how we were getting along," Margaret said. "She asked if I was finding everything I needed. And then she said, very kindly, that she hoped I understood that Caleb Voss was a good man, but that he'd been through a great deal and that some people who'd known him longer were," she used the phrase, "looking out for him." Caleb was quiet. "She meant it as a warning," Margaret said without particular heat, "in case I was some kind of adventuress coming out west to take advantage of a lonely rancher." "Dora Fletcher takes a lot upon herself," he said. "She's not wrong to look out for you," Margaret said. "If she'd known my situation, she might have been looking out for me too." He turned to look at her. You mean someone should have warned you about me? He said. I mean that the arrangement went both directions, she said. I was also a stranger coming to live with someone I didn't know. Nobody at the agency seemed particularly concerned about my welfare. She paused. Not that I expected them to be, but it's worth noticing. He turned that over. He hadn't, in fact, thought about it from that angle. He'd spent his time before her arrival thinking about what she might be, whether she'd be capable, whether she'd be honest, whether she could handle the work. He hadn't spent much time thinking about what this had been from her side. The act of getting on a train and riding through 2 states to a mountain town in winter to live with a man she'd exchanged 6 letters with. That was brave, he said. What you did. She seemed slightly surprised by that. I suppose it was, she said. I didn't think of it that way at the time. I thought of it as necessary. What made it necessary? She was quiet for a moment. The wagon moved through the winter road, the horses steady, the mountains visible above the tree line to the west. The ranch in Oregon went to Edmund's brother when Edmund died, she said. The will was... Edmund hadn't updated it in many years. Before we married, he'd made his brother the beneficiary of everything. He always meant to change it. He just never did. So I had 4 months after his death to make other arrangements. Caleb said nothing. I'm not telling you this for sympathy, she said quickly. I'm telling you so you understand that I came here with open eyes. I wasn't looking for romance. I wasn't looking for anything sentimental. I needed a place and a situation where I could be useful and not dependent on anyone's charity. That's what I was looking for when I answered your advertisement. And did you find it? He asked. She considered. The place is here, she said. The rest I'm still working out. He nodded slowly. He looked at the road ahead. For what it's worth, he said, you're not a charity case on this ranch, not even close. She didn't respond right away. The horses moved. The cold air was clean and sharp and smelled of pine and distant snow. Thank you, she said finally. Just that, simply, without dressing it up. February brought a 4-day storm that locked them inside together with nothing to do but wait it out. Caleb had weathered these before, alone, with whiskey and the same 3 books he'd read enough times that he could skip sections and still know what he'd missed. This time was different. They played cards. Margaret had brought a worn deck in her suitcase and was better at most games than she'd initially let on. And she read to him from a book she'd brought, a collected volume of short stories that he hadn't expected to enjoy and found himself listening to with more attention than he gave to much else. She had a reading voice that was direct and unhurried, and she didn't perform the stories, she just told them, which was better. On the second night of the storm, with the wind pressing against every wall at once, and the fire stoked as high as it would go, she put the book down and said, "Tell me something about this land." He looked up from the knife he was cleaning. "What do you want to know?" "Something you like about it," she said. "Not the practical parts. Something you'd miss." He thought about it. "There's a ridge," he said, "about 40 minutes north of the upper pasture. In spring, when the snow comes off it, there's a moment, maybe a week, some years only 3 or 4 days, when the whole face of it goes green. Not gradually. It looks like it happens overnight. One day it's white, and the next it's green, and it's so sharp and sudden it looks wrong, almost. Like someone made a mistake with the colors." She was watching him. "I ride up there every year when I think it's coming," he said. "Stand there for a while, then come back." "Alone?" she asked. "Always alone," he said. "Up till now, anyway." She looked at him for a moment. "I'd like to see that," she said, "when spring comes." "I'll take you up," he said. He went back to the knife. It wasn't a promise of anything beyond a ride up a ridge to look at a hillside turning green, but the way she'd said it, "I'd like to see that," and the way he'd answered, "I'll take you up," felt like something was being established between them, some small structure built from planks of ordinary words. By the 3rd day, they'd stopped measuring out their conversations carefully. She told him about her years managing Edmund's business records, the suppliers who tried to shortchange them on weights, the contracts she'd caught discrepancies in, the year she'd identified a pattern of false invoicing from a wool merchant in Portland that had been costing them money for 3 seasons before anyone noticed. She talked about it with the animation of someone who'd been good at something for a long time without being told they were. You ran the business, he said. I kept the records, she said. That's not the same thing as just keeping records. She looked at him. No, she said. It's not. He was quiet for a moment. Did Edmund know that? What you were actually doing? Edmund knew the operation ran better when I handled the paperwork, she said. Whether he understood why, I'm not sure. He wasn't a man who looked at things too closely if they were working. Caleb thought about that. He missed a lot, it sounds like. He did, she said. And then after a moment, most people do, with women of a certain type. He looked at her across the table. The lamp between them made everything warm-edged. What type? He asked. The kind that do things quietly and don't require anyone to notice, she said. People assume that means there's nothing to notice. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, I've noticed. She met his eyes. He held them for a beat and then looked back at the knife in his hands, and she picked up the book again, and the fire settled into its steady, low roar, and neither of them said anything else about it. 3 weeks into February, the weather broke enough for him to ride the fence line. He left before first light and came back at midday to find Margaret in the barn. She'd been there a while, apparently. The floor had been swept, the tack reorganized on its hooks, and she was up on a short stool working on a section of the roof where a board had warped and was letting in light in the wrong place. There's a proper ladder in the corner, he said. I couldn't reach the section I needed with the ladder, she said, not stopping. You could have waited for me. The wind last night moved the board further, she said. Another couple of days and it would have cracked through. The horses don't need a gap in their roof in February. He looked up at what she was doing. She'd found the right nails and had the board positioned correctly, and the hammerwork was clean. Not tentative, not overdone. She'd done this before. You're going to fall off that stool, he said. I haven't yet, she said. That's not reassuring. She drove the last nail and climbed down. She looked up at the repair and then at him, and there was a quality in her face in that moment that he recognized from watching people do work they were good at. A small, private satisfaction that wasn't about showing anyone anything, just about the thing being done right. I was a rancher's wife for 23 years, she said. You learn what needs fixing. He looked at the repaired board. He looked at her. You were more than a rancher's wife, he said. She brushed sawdust off her coat. I was whatever I needed to be, she said. That's what you do. He handed her a rag for her hands, and she took it without comment, and they stood in the barn with the horses moving quietly around them, and outside the February wind came off the mountains with its usual indifference, and neither of them was particularly inclined to move. Margaret, he said. She looked at him. I'm glad you came, he said. I want you to know that. She held his gaze for a moment. Her expression was complicated in the way that things are when several different feelings are happening at once, and none of them are easy to name. So am I, she said. She handed the rag back and walked toward the barn door, and he stood for a moment in the middle of the floor before following her out into the cold. The sky was low and the light was flat, and the land stretched out in every direction, the same pale winter color it had been for months. But something about the afternoon felt different. He wasn't sure he could have explained it to anyone. He just noticed it, the way you notice the temperature shift when something in the weather is thinking about changing. He followed her back toward the cabin. March came in the way March always did in the Bitterroot Range, with false promises. A week of mild days that made you think the worst was over, and then a last hard freeze that caught everything off guard, including the people who should have known better. Caleb had lived through enough of them to not be fooled, but there was something about the softening light in the third week of February that made even the most seasoned rancher want to believe. Margaret had started a small kitchen garden along the south wall of the cabin. Herbs, mostly, things she'd brought from Oregon as cuttings or seed packets wrapped in cloth. Sage, thyme, the gray-green plant she used in the hand poultice. She'd cleared the snow back from the wall where the stone foundation held some heat, and built a small wind barrier from split wood she'd found in the scrap pile. And she was coaxing the first thin green shoots out of the frozen ground by sheer determination and what Caleb privately thought was an unreasonable amount of faith in the weather. He'd told her the freeze was coming. She'd moved the more fragile seedlings inside to the windowsill and left the rest. The freeze came. Most of what she'd left outside survived. He didn't say anything about that either. The running tally of things she'd been right about was getting long enough that bringing it up felt counterproductive. What he did say, one morning in early March, while she was transplanting one of the windowsill seedlings back outside with the focused care of someone handling something genuinely worth protecting, was, "You know this soil isn't going to give you much until May." "I know that," she said. "Then what are you doing?" She sat back on her heels and looked at the small arrangement of shoots along the wall. "Getting them established," she said. "The roots need time even if nothing's growing yet. By the time the ground warms properly, they'll be ready, instead of starting from zero." He looked at the seedlings. They were small and unremarkable, and the wall behind them was weathered gray and the ground was still half frozen. It looked like stubborn hope more than good strategy. But he thought about it later, out in the far pasture checking the herd, and he thought that was probably the same thing Margaret had done when she'd arrived at Red Hollow Station in December, getting herself established in thin soil, working the roots in before anything was ready to grow. He wasn't sure what to do with that thought, so he set it aside and turned the horse home. The two men arrived on a Wednesday. Caleb was in the barn when he heard the wagon on the road, and he came out to see an unfamiliar rig pulling up to the cabin yard. A good wagon, not a ranch wagon, the kind that was meant to look prosperous rather than do work. Two men on the seat, both in town clothes that were wrong for the weather and the road they'd just traveled. One was young and broad-shouldered with the flat expression of someone paid to stand nearby and look large. The other was older, somewhere past 50, with a trimmed beard and a leather case on his knee. Caleb walked toward them without hurrying. "Mr. Voss," the older man said. He climbed down from the wagon with the careful movements of someone unaccustomed to doing it without steps. "My name is Gerald Croft. I represent Meridian Land Holdings out of Helena. I was hoping you might have a few minutes." Caleb stopped 10 feet away. "I don't know any Meridian Land Holdings." "No reason you would," Croft said pleasantly. He had a practiced pleasant, smooth and consistent, the kind that came from using it on people who hadn't asked for it. "But I believe you'll find we have some mutual interests. May we come inside?" "Say what you came to say from there," Caleb said. Something shifted in Croft's expression just slightly. He adjusted to it. "Of course," he said. He opened the leather case and produced a document. "Mr. Voss, Meridian Land Holdings is the current holder of a land contract that includes your property, specifically the 212 acres you currently occupy, including the structures." Caleb looked at him. "That's not possible," he said. "I understand this comes as a surprise," Croft said, and he said it the way people say things they have said many times before. "The contract in question dates to 1881, when the original title holder, a man named Harlan Briggs, entered into a sales agreement for the land. The agreement included provisions for sale transfer under certain conditions, which Meridian Holdings believes have now been met. We have documentation." "I've held title to this land for 19 years, Caleb said. His voice had gone flat and deliberate. "I bought it from the Briggs estate, from Harlan Briggs's son, with a clear deed." "That deed may be in question," Croft said. "We're not here to create conflict, Mr. Voss. We're here to open a dialogue. Meridian is prepared to offer fair compensation for the property, and—" "Get off my land," Caleb said. The young man on the wagon shifted. Croft held up a hand. "Mr. Voss, I said get off my land," Caleb said. "You want to make claims about my title, you do it through a court. You don't come to a man's property and tell him it isn't his, not without a better showing than a piece of paper out of a case." Croft looked at him for a moment. The pleasant didn't drop entirely, but something underneath it hardened. "We will be filing in Harlan County," he said. "I want you to understand the situation before that happens, rather than after. The filing will include a request for immediate possession pending resolution." "Then file," Caleb said. "And then we'll see." Croft got back on the wagon with the same careful movements and said, as if it were an afterthought, "You may want to consult with someone who knows land law, Mr. Voss. The contract documentation is substantial." The wagon turned and went back down the road. Caleb stood in the yard until it was out of sight. His jaw was set and his hands were still, and he was doing what he did when something serious had happened, which was to hold very quiet on the outside while the inside worked through it. Margaret was standing in the cabin doorway. He walked toward her. "You heard," he said. "Enough of it," she said. "Come inside." She let him sit for a few minutes before she said anything. She put coffee in front of him and sat across the table and waited, which was the right thing to do because he needed a few minutes to move through the first wave of it, the hot, blind anger that comes when someone threatens something you built, before he could think straight. "Tell me everything you know about the original deed," she said. He looked up. "The deed," she said. "When you bought from the Briggs estate, who handled it, where you filed, what the documentation looked like." He breathed out slowly. "I bought it in the spring of 1874. The Briggs boy, Thomas, his name was, he wanted to sell fast. His father had died the previous winter, and he didn't want the land, wanted the cash. We agreed on a price, signed a deed of transfer, and I filed it at the county land office in Harlan." He paused. "Paid in full. No liens, no contingencies." "Do you have your copy of the deed?" "In the strong box," he said. "Back room." "Get it," she said. He went and got the strong box and brought it to the table and opened it. Inside were the things men keep in strong boxes. The original deed, folded and worn at the creases, his marriage certificate, his son's birth record, a few letters he'd never thrown away. He took out the deed and handed it across. Margaret unfolded it carefully. She didn't rush. She read it the way he'd seen her read everything, with her full attention, moving through it methodically, not skimming. "Who witnessed it?" she asked without looking up. "Town notary? Man named Ferris? Been dead 15 years. And the Harlan County Land Office, they have the registered copy?" "They should," he said. "That's how filing works." She turned the deed over and looked at the back and then turned it front again. "This is a standard deed of transfer," she said. "Clear language. No contingencies written into it, no clauses reserving any prior claims." "I know what I bought," he said. "I know you do," she said. "I'm telling you what I'm seeing because what that man described, a prior contract with provisions for transfer, would have to predate this deed and would have had to be recorded somewhere. If it was recorded, it would have been visible when you bought. Your deed would have been issued with the prior claim listed as an encumbrance." He leaned forward. "It wasn't." "That's what I thought," she said, "which means either it wasn't recorded at the time or it didn't exist at the time." She folded the deed back carefully and set it on the table. "Have you ever heard of Meridian Land Holdings?" "Never." "What about the area? Has there been talk in town about land companies buying up property?" He thought. "There's been talk," he said slowly. "Past 6 months or so. Farley Oates lost a section of his east grazing land to some company out of Helena. He said they showed up with paperwork he'd never seen before, filed something in the county court, and by the time he got a lawyer, the court had issued a provisional order." Margaret's expression shifted. "That's a pattern," she said. "What do you mean?" She looked at him steadily. "I mean, this isn't about your land specifically, or not only about your land. If they're doing this to multiple properties in the same region—" She stopped. "How many cattle operations are there within 20 miles of your ranch?" 6, 7 good-sized ones, dozen smaller. And your land sits between most of them." He saw what she was thinking. "They want the whole valley," he said. "They want the access routes," she said. "Whoever controls the land in the middle controls who can move cattle to the rail line. That's not speculation. That's how these things work. I've seen contracts like this before, written specifically to give a company leverage over movement rights, even if they don't end up with full ownership." Caleb was quiet. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. "What did you see in those contracts?" he asked. "The ones in Oregon. False execution dates," she said. "Signatures that didn't match the original party's signature on file. Witnesses who couldn't be located or who, when located, had no memory of witnessing anything." She paused. "And altered consideration amounts. The price listed in the contract changed from the original, usually to something nominal, something that made it look like a legitimate transaction instead of a manufactured one." He looked at her. "You think that's what this is?" I think that man in the nice wagon has done this before, she said. And I think the documents he's carrying deserve a much closer look than he's expecting anyone to give them. But they went to Red Hollow the next morning. Caleb went first to see Len Marsh, the one man in Red Hollow who had any working knowledge of land law, though he was a livestock attorney by practice, and the first thing he said when Caleb explained the situation was that this was outside his usual territory. But Len looked at the deed and agreed with everything Margaret had said. The document was clean, the filing was proper, and any prior claim should have appeared as an encumbrance at the time of purchase. That doesn't mean they can't file, Len said. It means they're on weak ground if they do, but weak ground doesn't always stop these companies. They count on people not having the money or the time to fight them properly. What would fighting them properly require? Margaret asked. Len looked at her across his desk. He'd been doing the thing men did when they hadn't expected a woman to ask the practical question, recalibrating, deciding whether to answer her or look at Caleb when he spoke. He decided, apparently, to answer her directly. Getting ahead of the filing, he said. If they file first and get a provisional order, you're on defense. If you can challenge the legitimacy of their underlying document before they file, you change the situation. But to do that, you'd need to see what they actually have. They'll be transporting the original documents, Margaret said. You said they're filing in Harlan County. That's what the man told me, Caleb said. Then the originals go through Red Hollow, she said. There's only one route from Helena to Harlan County, and it comes through Red Hollow Station. Len Marsh looked at her more carefully. Mrs. Voss, if we could examine those documents before they're filed, she said, what would we need to find to challenge them? He leaned back. Signature irregularities, dating inconsistencies, evidence of alteration. If the original document shows signs of amendment after execution, changed dates, overwritten figures, a second hand on the ink, that's fraud, not just a legal dispute. Fraud changes everything. Margaret nodded once. Caleb looked at her. He could see her working through something, and he'd learned enough about how her mind moved to wait for it rather than interrupt. When did Croft say they'd be filing? She asked him. He didn't give a date, he said. But they had to travel from Helena to get here, she said. And they'll need to go back before they go to Harlan. That's a 2-day trip in good weather. They'll rest at least one night. She looked at Len. Who runs the freight office at Red Hollow Station? Bauer, Len said. Otto Bauer. Does Otto Bauer know Caleb? Everyone in this county knows Caleb, Len said. She looked at Caleb. We need to know when Croft is moving those documents through the station. Otto Bauer knew Caleb the way small-town men know each other, not intimately but reliably, with the accumulated weight of years of occasional dealings and the knowledge that the other man was straight. Caleb had helped pull his freight wagon out of a ditch 2 winters ago without being asked. Otto remembered things like that. He also, as it turned out, had processed a freight manifest that morning for Gerald Croft, a document case being sent on the Thursday afternoon train to Harlan County, care of the county land office. Thursday afternoon was 2 days away. Caleb drove the wagon back to the ranch in a silence that had a different quality than his usual ones, tighter, directed inward, turning something over and over. Margaret sat beside him and let him have it. Half a mile from the ranch, he said, What you're thinking about doing? What am I thinking about doing? She said. The document case, he said. Being at the station Thursday. She looked at him. I'm thinking we have a right to examine any document that purports to include your property, she said, in a public place in front of witnesses, before it disappears into a county filing system where getting another look at it takes a lawyer in 6 months. And if there's nothing wrong with it, then we've lost nothing, she said. We already knew what we were facing. And if there is something wrong with it, then Len Marsh needs to be there, she said, and whoever else in that town would want to know what Meridian Land Holdings is doing to the ranches in this valley. He looked at the road ahead. You'd be putting yourself in the middle of it. I'm already in the middle of it, she said. It's my home too. The word landed between them quietly. She'd said it simply, without drama, the way you say something true that you hadn't quite said aloud before. His home too. He'd heard it. He thought she knew he'd heard it. He didn't comment on it, But something in his chest shifted slightly, like a board that's been warped by weather settling back toward level. "All right," he said, "we'll be at the station Thursday." Dead. Thursday came cold and clear, the kind of late winter day in Montana where the sky is an impossible blue, and the cold has a clean quality to it instead of the gray, grinding weight of midwinter. Caleb and Margaret arrived at Red Hollow Station 2 hours before the afternoon train. Len Marsh was already there, standing near the freight office with his briefcase and his expression of cautious professional neutrality. Dora Fletcher was there. He hadn't expected that. She'd heard, through the mechanism of Red Hollow information transfer, which was both immediate and comprehensive, that Meridian Land Holdings had been to see Caleb, and that they'd also sent a letter in January to the Oates property, and that 2 other ranchers in the valley had received visits from company representatives in the past 4 months. She'd told 6 people, who told others, and by Thursday morning there were 11 people at the Red Hollow station who had no freight to send and no travel planned. Caleb looked at the small gathering and said nothing. Margaret looked at it and said quietly, "People look out for each other here." "Sometimes," he said. Gerald Croft arrived at 1:30 with his large companion and the leather document case. He came onto the platform and stopped when he saw the assembled group, and something in his face did a quick, careful reassessment. "Mr. Voss," he said. "Mr. Croft," Caleb said, "I'd like to look at those documents before you file them." "That's not something I'm in a position—" "My name is Leonard Marsh," Len said, stepping forward. "I represent Mr. Voss's interests in this matter. Under Montana Territory land law, a party named in a deed transfer claim has the right to examine the originating documentation prior to county filing. That right exists in statute." He produced a folded paper. "I've written out the citation if you'd like to see it." Croft's companion moved slightly. Caleb watched him. "Mr. Croft," Margaret said. Croft looked at her. He'd looked at her before, at the ranch, in the way men look at women who are present but not anticipated, assessing her role, deciding she was peripheral. He was doing it again now, and she waited for him to finish doing it, and then she said, "I spent 16 years managing land contract documentation. I know what an original document looks like, and I know what an altered one looks like. I know what a second hand of ink looks like on a contract that was supposedly executed in a single session. I know how to read a dating inconsistency, and I know how to identify a signature that doesn't match the signing party's other documents on file." The platform was quiet. The wind moved across it. "You show those documents to Mr. Marsh here," she continued, "and he files his examination with the county clerk before your own filing is processed. Or you get on this train with them and file them as planned, and we file a fraud challenge the same afternoon, and the examination happens in court instead of on this platform." She paused. "The difference is that in court, everything you're carrying becomes part of a public record. Every person in this valley who has a property dispute with Meridian Holdings will have access to it." The people standing on the platform were very still. Gerald Croft looked at Margaret for a long moment. He looked at the small crowd. He looked at Len Marsh with his briefcase and his citations. He looked at Caleb, who was standing quietly with his arms at his sides, watching. "These documents are proprietary business records," Croft said. His pleasant voice had gone thin. "Then show us the proprietary business record that includes my husband's land," Margaret said, "and let Mr. Marsh determine whether it's legitimate." Croft was quiet. The train was audible in the distance now, the first sound of it coming around the mountain bend. He opened the case. Geek. Len Marsh spent 40 minutes with the documents while the train sat at the platform and its passengers and the station master waited with varying degrees of patience. The large companion stood nearby doing nothing because there was nothing to do, and Croft stood with his hands in his pockets looking at the middle distance. Margaret stood at Len's shoulder the entire time. Caleb stood back. He watched her. He watched the way she moved through the documents with Len, pointing out things, asking him to look at specific sections, holding pages at angles to the light. She was in her element in a way he hadn't seen before, a different quality of competence than the practical ranch work he'd observed all winter. This was precision and memory and knowledge, and she deployed it with the same quiet thoroughness she brought to everything else. Len found 3 things. The execution date on the original Briggs contract was written over, not erased cleanly, but overwritten. The original ink still barely visible under the correction. The date that had been changed moved the contract signing back by 2 years, to a point before Caleb had purchased the land. The consideration amount, the purchase price listed in the contract, was a number that had clearly been altered. The original figure, faintly visible, was a standard land value for the period. The current figure was $5, and the witness signature did not match the name printed beneath it. It didn't come close. Len looked up from the documents and at Croft. "I'll be filing with the county clerk this afternoon," he said, "and with the territorial prosecutor's office in the morning." Croft picked up the document case without speaking. He and his companion got on the train. It left the platform 7 minutes later. The crowd on the platform dispersed slowly, the way crowds do after something that came to a head, and resolved more quietly than anticipated. A little uncertain, a little relieved, talking in pairs. Dora Fletcher said something to Caleb that he answered briefly. The other ranchers shook his hand. One of them, Boyd Rutherford, who ran cattle 2 ridges over, shook Margaret's hand as well, which she accepted without ceremony. When the platform had mostly cleared, Caleb and Margaret walked to the wagon. He helped her up. She didn't hesitate this time. He climbed up on his side and picked up the reins, and they sat for a moment in the cold, clear afternoon light. 3 discrepancies, he said. There were probably more, she said, but 3 is enough. He looked at the station. The train was long gone, the track empty, the platform quiet again. The same platform where he'd stood in December in the dark and the snow and watched one passenger step off the last train. "I would have fought it," he said. "Without you, I would have fought it, but I would have been fighting it without knowing what I was looking at." She was quiet for a moment. "You would have figured it out eventually." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it would have been through the courts for 3 years and cost me more than I could afford." He turned to look at her directly. "You knew what to look for before we ever opened that case." "I've seen versions of it before," she said. "Different company, different valley, same method." "Why didn't you say that?" "Before Thursday, when I told you what Croft had said." She considered. "Because I wasn't sure until I saw it," she said. "I didn't want to tell you what it was and be wrong. That wouldn't have helped you." He held her gaze. "Margaret," he said. "What?" He didn't have a word for what he wanted to say. It wasn't gratitude exactly, though it was that. It wasn't something bigger than gratitude exactly, though it was becoming that. He was 53 years old, and he was sitting on a wagon seat in the cold outside Red Hollow Station, and he was looking at a woman who had come to his ranch in December with 1 suitcase and had, in the space of a few months, fixed his curtains and organized his shelves and tended his hand and argued about his fences and read to him in a storm and saved his land. He wasn't sure there was a word for what that was. "Thank you," he said. It wasn't enough, but it was what he had. She looked at him for a moment. Her eyes were steady, and her expression had that complicated quality again, the one that held several things at once. "Take me home," she said. He picked up the reins and turned the horses toward the mountain road, and the afternoon light came off the snow in long, flat angles, and the sky above the Bitterroot Range was the deep, uncompromising blue of a winter day that was finally starting to think about spring. The territorial prosecutor's office sent a letter 3 weeks after Len Marsh's filing. Caleb read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while Margaret refilled his coffee without being asked, the way she always did now, and when he looked up, she was already watching him. "They're opening an investigation," he said, "into Meridian Land Holdings. Not just the claim against this property, the whole operation." She sat down across from him. "Oates's land too?" "And the Rutherford section they were disputing," he said. "And apparently there are 2 more properties in the next county over that filed similar complaints in the past year." He set the letter down. "Len says the prosecutor thinks it's systematic, that Meridian has been running this scheme across 3 counties, maybe more." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "How long before it resolves?" "Len says months," he said. "Could be longer. But the provisional filing is suspended while the investigation runs. They can't move on any of the properties until the prosecutor closes the case." She nodded slowly. "Your ranch is safe," she said. She said it simply, the way she said most things, but there was something underneath it. Not relief exactly. more like the careful exhale of someone who'd been holding tension in their body for weeks and was only now starting to release it. "Our ranch," he said. She looked at him. He said it the same way she'd said, "Take me home," on the platform. Plainly, without making a production of it, but meaning it. He picked up his coffee cup and looked out the window at the morning. The light was different now than it had been in December. Still cold, still hard, but with a quality of angle to it that suggested the sun was remembering where it was supposed to be. She didn't say anything in return, but when he glanced back at her, she had an expression he'd seen before. The one that held more than it showed. The one that meant she was working through something she wasn't ready to put into words. He gave her the same thing she always gave him: space and time and the presence of someone who wasn't going anywhere. Spring in the Bitterroot came the way he described it to her during the storm, suddenly, with the quality of a decision rather than a gradual change. One week the world was still the muted colors of winter, and the next the south-facing slopes were running with snowmelt, and the first thin green was appearing along the creek banks, and the horses were restless in a way they only got when the air was carrying something new. He kept his word about the ridge. On a morning in the last week of March, when the sky was clear and the upper trail was passable but only just, he saddled 2 horses and told her to wear the heavier coat because the wind up high would still cut. She came out of the cabin pulling on her gloves and looked at the horses and then at him. "Today?" she asked. "Weather's right," he said. "It won't last." She swung up into her saddle with the ease of someone who'd been riding working horses for 30 years, which she had, and they went up the north trail single file with him in front, and the horses picking their way carefully over the remaining patches of ice. It took closer to an hour than 40 minutes because the trail was wet and he didn't push the pace. He heard her behind him, the steady sound of her horse, the occasional small sound of her adjusting her seat on a difficult section. She didn't talk during the climb. Neither did he. The trail was its own kind of conversation, the mountain making its demands and both of them paying attention. They came up onto the ridge and he pulled his horse to a stop and waited for her to come alongside. The south face of the opposite slope was green. Not the tentative, patchy green of things that weren't sure yet, but the full, sudden green he'd tried to describe, vivid and definitive, running from the tree line down to the snow line in a sheet of color so sharp it looked recent, like something had happened here this morning while no one was watching. The snowmelt was still running off the upper sections in thin silver lines, and where it crossed the new grass it caught the light, and the whole face of the mountain was doing something between stillness and movement that Caleb had never found adequate words for in 20 years of coming up here. He didn't try to find words for it now, he just watched it. Beside him, Margaret was also watching, and he let her have the first few minutes of it without talking. "You said it looked wrong," she said finally, "when you described it. Too fast." "Doesn't it?" She looked at it for a while. "It looks like it was ready," she said. "Like it had been ready and just needed the right morning." He turned to look at her. She was sitting straight in the saddle the way she always did, her silver hair loose from its pins on one side where the wind had been at it on the climb, her coat with the collar up. She was looking at the green slope with an expression he didn't quite know how to categorize, something between recognition and wistfulness, the look of someone seeing something that means more than just the thing itself. "Margaret," he said. She turned to look at him. He'd been working toward saying something for weeks. Not a single thing so much as the accumulation of many things. The curtains, the coffee, the fence argument, the card games and the storm, the conversation about Clara, the way she'd stood at Len Marsh's shoulder on that platform and taken those documents apart with 16 years of knowledge and a kind of fierce, quiet competence that still moved something in him when he thought about it. He'd been circling all of it, the way you circle something you want to see clearly but aren't sure you're ready for. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." "All right," she said. "When you came here," he said, "in December, was it only because you needed a place?" She held his gaze. The wind moved across the ridge between them. "Yes," she said. "At the time, yes. That was what it was." "And now?" he said. She was quiet for longer than he expected. He waited. "Now I don't know how to separate what it started as from what it became," she said. I came here because I needed a situation, and then the situation became a place, and the place became... She stopped. You, she said simply. The place became you. He said nothing for a moment. I'm not an easy man, he said. I know that. No, she said. You're not. You're private and you're stubborn and you don't like asking for help and you'll argue about fences in bad weather. She paused. But you don't pretend to be something you're not. And you don't say things you don't mean. And when I tell you something true, you listen to it. Those aren't small things, Caleb. He looked at the green slope. I didn't think I wanted this, he said. Whatever this is. I told myself I needed a practical arrangement, someone to help run the place. I believe that. I know, she said. You weren't lying. No, he said. But I was wrong. He turned back to her. About what I needed. About what I was still capable of needing. She looked at him with the complicated expression, the one with more in it than the surface showed. He'd stopped trying to parse its individual components. He'd learned that with Margaret, the expression meant she was feeling more than she was going to say, and that the feeling was real, and that the not saying wasn't coldness, but caution, the caution of someone who'd been disappointed enough times to be careful with hope. I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give, he said. I just wanted you to know what's true from my side. She breathed out slowly. The horses shifted beneath them, restless with standing still. I know what's true from your side, she said. I've known for a while. She looked at the mountain. I think I was waiting to see if it held. And? He said. It's holding, she said. He nodded once. He looked at the green slope for another moment, and then at her, and then back at the trail. We should head down before the trail ices again, he said. Yes, she said. They turned the horses and started down, and neither of them said anything else about it on the ride, and neither of them needed to. April brought the full work of spring, calving, fence repair across every line on the property, the grinding effort of moving the herd to the upper pastures now that the snow had retreated enough to make it possible. The poultice had become a nightly thing, or nearly nightly, and Caleb had stopped mentioning that it wasn't necessary because it clearly was, and they both knew it. The kitchen garden along the south wall had become, against all winter odds, an actual garden. The herbs Margaret had started in February were established now, and she'd added vegetables in March when the ground softened. Carrots, onions, a row of beans that weren't going to do much until June, but that she'd planted anyway with the same logic she'd applied to the seedlings. Getting the roots in early. One morning in mid-April, she came in from the garden with dirt on her hands and her boots, and a look on her face that he'd learned to read as her version of pleased, not demonstrative, just settled, the expression of someone whose work is going the way it ought to. The beans are coming, she said. It's too cold for beans, he said, from the table where he was going over accounts. Not in that corner, she said. The foundation holds the heat. I told you. You told me, he agreed. She washed her hands at the basin. Boyd Rutherford's wife came by while you were in the far pasture, she said. June Rutherford. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to help with the community ledger for the Spring Cattle Association meeting. Apparently whoever did it last year made a mess of the numbers. Caleb looked up. What did you tell her? I told her I'd look at it, she said. She's bringing it next week. She dried her hands. Is that all right with you? Why would it not be? You don't always love it when I take on things that expand into your schedule, she said. He gave her a look. One time, he said, I said one thing one time about the harness project taking over the barn table. You said 3 things, she said. Over 2 days. The barn table is my workspace. The harness is in better shape than it was. He went back to his accounts. Help June Rutherford with the ledger, he said. She made a sound that was the functional equivalent of a smile and went to put a pot on. This was what it was now, and had been for some time, and he'd stopped pretending he didn't notice it. The ease of it. Not the absence of friction, because there was plenty of friction. There were arguments and disagreements and mornings when the accumulated difficulty of ranch life made them both short with each other in ways they'd have to unpack later. But underneath that, a fundamental ease. The kind that comes when you stop performing and start just being wherever you are with whoever you're with. He hadn't felt it in 11 years. He'd forgotten, in those 11 years, that it existed. It was in the third week of April that Margaret told him the thing she hadn't told him. Not about Edmund. He knew enough about Edmund to understand that part. Not about Oregon, or the will, or the 4 months that followed Edmund's death. He knew those pieces too. It was the thing before that. The thing she'd carried into the marriage with Edmund that he'd never known, and that she'd stopped knowing how to talk about over 23 years of not being heard. It happened on an ordinary evening. He'd come in late from a long day of fence work, and they'd eaten without much conversation, both tired in the specific way of physical work, and she'd been reading and he'd been going through a stack of correspondence that had built up since the Meridian business, when she'd put the book down and looked at the table and said his name. Caleb. I need to tell you something, she said, about before Oregon. He set down the letter he was holding. Her hands were in her lap, visible to him across the table, and they were still. Margaret's hands were almost always doing something, and when they weren't, it meant she was making herself hold steady. I was married before Edmund, she said, before Oregon. I was 23. His name was Robert Ellison, Edmund's older brother. Caleb was quiet. He died in the second year of the marriage, she said. An accident on the farm. Edmund and I married afterward. It was what made sense to both families at the time. I was young and widowed, and Edmund was 10 years older and steady, and it seemed like the practical thing. Did you want to marry Edmund? Caleb asked. I didn't not want to, she said. That's not the same thing as wanting. I understood what I was agreeing to. She paused. What I didn't understand was that Edmund knew things about me that he never said he knew. Things Robert had told him. About why. About reasons why the first marriage had been difficult. Caleb waited. I lost 2 babies, she said. In the first marriage. One before he was born and one at 4 months. Robert blamed me for it. He wasn't a cruel man in most ways, but he'd decided that was something a woman was responsible for, and he said things to me in that second year that you don't. She stopped. That you don't put back once they've been said. The room was very quiet. Edmund knew all of this before we married, she said. He never said he knew. But there were things he said over the years, small things, the kind you'd miss if you weren't paying attention, that told me Robert had told him. And he'd married me anyway, which sounds generous, but what it really meant was that he had something over me that he never needed to name. He just carried it. And I carried knowing he carried it. Caleb sat with that. He let it sit properly rather than rushing to fill it. That's a long time to carry something like that, he said. 23 years, she said. Yes. Margaret. He said her name the way he'd learned to say it, with the particular weight he'd come to give it without meaning to, the way a word changes when you've said it 10,000 times in the privacy of your own mind. What Robert said to you. That wasn't true. She looked at him. You can't know that. I know enough about how bodies work and how loss works and how men blame women for things they have no business blaming them for, he said. I know that what happened to you wasn't something you did. He paused. And I know that you've been carrying around a version of yourself that someone else built out of his own cruelty, and living inside it for so long you might have started believing it fit. Her eyes were bright. She wasn't a woman who cried easily. He'd never seen her cry. Not in 4 months of hard weather and legal threats and the full difficulty of frontier life. She didn't cry now, but her eyes were bright, and her hands in her lap were no longer still. I didn't tell you for sympathy, she said with some effort. I know you didn't, he said. I told you because I didn't want to have something you didn't know, she said. Not anymore. He got up from his chair and came around the table and sat down in the empty chair beside her, which was not something he would have done 4 months ago, and maybe not 2 months ago. He sat close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, and he put his rough, damaged hand over hers on the table and left it there. She turned her hand and held his. They sat like that for a while. The fire went on doing what fire does. Outside, the April night had the particular quality of early spring, cold still, but with something different moving through it, the way air changes when the land underneath is waking up. Caleb, she said, after a long while. What? That first night, she said. In the wagon. You said you didn't know how to share a space with another person anymore. I remember. You've been sharing it fine, she said. He was quiet for a moment. So have you, he said. She squeezed his hand once and let it go and picked up her book, and he went back to his correspondence. And the evening went on the way evenings do when nothing dramatic is happening, which is to say it went on quietly and fully, with the fire and the lamp and the two people and all the ordinary sounds of a house being lived in. May came in warm and the ranch came alive the way it did every year, but differently this year, or he experienced it differently, which amounted to the same thing. The calves that had come in April were out in the pastures now, unsteady and loud. The kitchen garden had overtaken its original small section, and Margaret had expanded it along the full south wall, and there were beans coming and young onion tops, and the herbs in their established rows gave the whole south side of the cabin a smell that hit Caleb every morning when he came out the door, and that he'd stopped being able to imagine not being there. Neighbors came more often, not because Caleb had become sociable, he hadn't, fundamentally, but because Margaret was the kind of person that other people found reasons to visit. June Rutherford came with the ledger and stayed 2 hours and left with the ledger corrected and 3 of Margaret's herb cuttings in a wrapped cloth. Boyd Rutherford came to talk cattle prices and ended up staying for supper. Dora Fletcher came on a Saturday, and she and Margaret sat on the porch in the thin May sunshine for most of the afternoon, and Caleb, passing by on his way to the barn, heard more laughter from that porch in 2 hours than he'd heard from the property in a decade. He stood in the barn doorway for a moment, listening to it. He had a memory of Clara laughing on that same porch years ago, in a summer that felt like someone else's life now. The memory didn't hurt the way it used to. It was just a memory, real and present, and belonging to a part of himself that was still there, intact, not replaced but joined by something new that had grown up alongside it. He went about his work. One evening in the middle of May, Len Marsh sent word that the territorial prosecutor had concluded enough of the investigation to formally dismiss Meridian Land Holdings' claim and issue a finding of fraud against the company's principals. Gerald Croft had already left the territory, which everyone had expected. The other affected ranchers were having their situations resolved similarly. Caleb read the letter and handed it to Margaret without speaking. She read it and handed it back. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. She went back to what she'd been doing. He sat with the letter for a moment longer, then put it in the strongbox with the deed, with the marriage certificate, with his son's birth record and Clara's letters. He closed the box. He sat for a moment with his hand on it, not because he was sad exactly, but because he was aware of the weight of what was in there. Every document that marked the significant turns of a life, the entries and exits, the things that couldn't be undone. And then he was aware that the strongbox was in the back room of a cabin that smelled of herbs and coffee and wood smoke, and that from the front room he could hear Margaret moving around, the sound of her that had become as familiar to him as the sound of the ranch itself. He got up and went to the front room. She looked up from the table. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. He stopped. He looked at her sitting there in the lamplight, her silver hair pinned up and her reading glasses on the end of her nose that she'd finally stopped taking off quickly when he came in the room, and the herb cuttings on the shelf behind her, and the level curtains on the windows, and the coffee cup that was sitting by his chair because she'd made it for him without thinking about it. The way you do things for someone when you've stopped keeping track of whether they deserve it. "You look like you're trying to say something," she said. "I am," he said. "Then say it." He sat down in his chair. He picked up the coffee cup and held it. "I spent a long time after Clara died deciding that was it," he said. "That I'd had my portion of things and the rest was just getting through. I told myself that was realism, that only a fool would think otherwise at my age, in my situation." Margaret had set down what she was doing. "I was wrong about that," he said. "I want you to know I was wrong about that." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamplight was warm and the room was warm, and outside the May evening was doing what May evenings in Montana do, which is to make you feel, briefly, that the hardest part might actually be over. "I know you know," she said. He nodded. "Margaret," he said. "Yes." "I'm glad you were on that train," he said. She held his gaze. Her expression did the thing it did, the complicated thing, but this time there was something closer to the surface of it, less guarded, less held back. like something that had been waiting at a distance and had finally decided to come the rest of the way in. "So am I," she said. He drank his coffee. She picked up her book. The fire settled into its low, steady burn, and the cabin held them both, and the night outside was soft in the way that nights in late spring sometimes are, not demanding anything, not threatening anything, just present. It was enough. For the first time in a very long time, it was more than enough. The beans came in June. Margaret had been right about the corner, right about the foundation heat, right about getting the roots established early. The row she'd planted in March when Caleb said it was too cold produced the first pods in the second week of June, ahead of every kitchen garden in Red Hollow by at least 10 days, a fact that June Rutherford mentioned with genuine admiration and Dora Fletcher mentioned with the slightly competitive warmth of someone who grew excellent beans herself and knew it. Caleb didn't say anything about having told her it was too cold. That particular tally had gotten long enough that maintaining it required more energy than he had. What he did do on the morning she came in from the garden with the first real harvest, a basket of green beans that weren't much to look at individually but were collectively the evidence of months of patient, stubborn work, was take one from the basket and eat it right there in the kitchen, unwashed, standing up. She watched him. "Well?" she said. "Good bean," he said. She took the basket to the counter with the expression of someone receiving a high compliment who is choosing not to make a production of it. The summer moved the way summers move on working land, with a relentlessness that doesn't care how you feel about it, that just keeps producing the next thing requiring attention before you've finished the last. The cattle needed moving, the hay needed cutting, the creek at the north end of the property ran high through June from the snowmelt, and took out a section of low fence that Caleb spent the better part of 3 days replacing, while Margaret managed the daily ranch operations with the focused competence that had stopped surprising him and started simply being part of how the place ran. There were hard days. He'd be lying, even to himself, if he said otherwise. There was a week in July when the heat came off the valley floor in waves and everything was dry, and the work was brutal, and they were both short on sleep and shorter on patience. And on a Wednesday evening, they had an argument about water rationing for the garden versus the livestock that got sharp enough that she went to bed without finishing the conversation, and he sat at the table for an hour in the dark before following. In the morning, she said, "I was wrong about the livestock numbers. You were right to prioritize the trough." He said, "The garden water wasn't unreasonable. I came at it harder than I needed to." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "Yes," she said. "You did." "So did you," he said. "Yes," she said. "I did." That was the whole of it. They went to work. This, he'd come to understand, was what it actually looked like. Not the absence of conflict, but the capacity to move through it and come back to the same table. He'd had that with Clara. He'd forgotten it was something you could have, and then he'd forgotten you could forget it, and now here it was again, imperfect and functional and real. It was Boyd Rutherford who brought it up first, in the unsubtle way of a man who's been asked by his wife to say something and is getting it over with. He came by on a Saturday in late July, ostensibly to discuss the Fall Cattle Association meeting, and after they talked through that for 20 minutes on the porch, he said, with the air of someone changing lanes without signaling, "Margaret's been good for this place, Caleb." Caleb looked at him. "People notice," Boyd said, "in town, the way the property looks. The way you," he searched for the word, "the way you come into town now versus how you used to." "How did I used to come in?" Caleb said. "Like a man who was there to get what he needed and leave before anyone could ask him anything," Boyd said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "And now?" he said. Boyd shrugged. "Now you come in like a man who lives somewhere," he said. "There's a difference." Caleb looked out at the yard. Margaret was in the garden, visible from the porch, moving along the bean row with the focused attention she brought to everything. The south wall of the cabin behind her was green with the herbs and the climbing beans, and the curtains in the windows were level, and the whole place had a quality to it that Caleb had stopped noticing because it had become the baseline. But he saw it now through Boyd's description. The difference between a property that someone occupies and a property that someone lives in. He'd been occupying his for 11 years. He hadn't noticed when it tipped into the other thing, but it had. She's a remarkable woman, Boyd said. I know, Caleb said. Boyd glanced at him sideways. You told her that? In my own way, Caleb said. Boyd made a sound that suggested he found this insufficient, and that June had probably told him to push further, but that he'd decided he'd done enough. He picked up his hat. Well, he said, fall meeting's the 15th. We'll need the usual count from you by the 10th. You'll have it, Caleb said. Boyd left. Caleb sat on the porch for a while longer, watching Margaret work. He told her things. He told her he was glad she was on the train. He told her the ranch was theirs. He told her, as plainly as he knew how to, that she'd changed what the place was and what he was capable of. He'd held her hand at the table on the night she told him the hard things, and he'd meant everything he said about what Robert had done and what she'd carried. But Boyd's question sat with him. In his own way. He'd been doing things in his own way his whole life, which was another way of saying he'd been doing things in the way that felt safe, that didn't require him to be more open than he was naturally inclined to be. With Clara, that had worked because Clara was a woman who could read between his words and knew what was there. Margaret was not the same kind of reader, not because she was less perceptive. She was arguably more perceptive, but because she'd been in a marriage where what was unsaid was used against her, and silence had a different meaning for her than it did for him. He needed to be clearer. He thought about how to do that for 3 days, which was his way, and on the 4th day, he drove into Red Hollow. There was a silversmith in Red Hollow named Arno Pitts who worked out of a shop attached to the side of the dry goods store and who most people used for practical repairs, buckles, clasps, rings that had bent out of shape. He also did original work, though not often, because not many people in Red Hollow came in wanting original work. Caleb came in wanting original work. He knew what he wanted, and he described it as plainly as he described everything: a pendant, silver, the shape of the mountain flower that grew on the ridge in spring, the one that came in with the green when the snow came off the south face. He'd looked at it for 20 years and he knew what it looked like. He described it to Arno Pitts in practical terms: the shape of the petals, the way the center sat, the size he wanted. Arno looked at him with the assessment of a craftsman being asked to make something that mattered. 2 weeks, Arno said. I'll be back in 2 weeks, Caleb said. He drove home and said nothing about it. Margaret didn't ask where he'd been, which was her way. She didn't interrogate his movements, never had, and he extended the same courtesy to her. What she did do that evening was look at him slightly sideways once or twice, in the way she did when she thought something was happening that she didn't have enough information about, and he let her look and said nothing. Pertum. The summer finished its work, and September came down off the mountains with the first smell of what was coming. Not winter yet, not close, but the reminder that it existed. The aspen above the tree line had started to turn, that first pale gold that would deepen over the next weeks into the full color that made the high country look like it was burning. One evening, in the second week of September, Caleb came in from the barn and went to the back room and got the small wooden box Arno Pitts had given him 2 weeks prior, and that he'd been carrying around in his coat pocket and then leaving in the back room and then putting in his pocket again. He carried it to the front room. Margaret was at the table. She looked up. He set the box in front of her. She looked at it and then at him. Open it, he said. She opened it. Inside, on a piece of folded cloth, was the silver pendant. The mountain flower, petals shaped exactly as he'd described them, center sitting right, hanging from a fine chain. Arno had done it correctly, better than correctly, actually. The thing looked like itself. Margaret picked it up and held it in her palm, looking at it. He sat down across from her. That's the flower from the ridge, she said. Yes. She turned it in the light. Her expression was the complicated one, except that it was more unguarded than he'd ever seen it. The usual care she kept around her feelings had dropped or been set aside, or simply couldn't hold against whatever was happening in her right now. Caleb, she said. I've been thinking about what I want to say to you, he said. I've been thinking about it for a while. I'm going to say it badly, but I'm going to say it. She set the pendant down and looked at him. She was giving him her full attention with the particular quality of someone who understood that something real was being offered and was going to receive it properly. I thought I was building a practical arrangement, he said. I was honest about that. Not just with you, but with myself. I needed help to run the place, and I was too old and too far gone into my own silence to think I was capable of more than that. He paused. I was wrong. Not about the help. You've been that. You've been more of that than I knew how to ask for. But that's not what I'm talking about. He looked at his hands on the table, the damaged left hand that ached less now than it had in 2 years. I've been watching you, he said, since December. The way you do things. The way you came into a strange place in bad weather and started looking for what needed fixing without anyone asking you to. The way you handle problems, quietly, without drama, without needing anyone to see you do it. The way you talked to those people on that platform and took that document apart with everything you knew, and none of it was for show. It was just what you had, and you used it. He shook his head slightly. I've spent most of my life respecting people who were competent and honest and didn't make things about themselves. You're both of those things every day, without effort. Margaret was very still. But that's not it either, he said. That's not what I'm trying to say. Then say it, she said quietly. I love you, he said. That's what I'm saying. I didn't expect to. I didn't think I was going to. But it happened the way things happen when you're not watching for them. Gradually and then all at once. And by the time I noticed, it was already just true. The room was quiet. Outside, the September evening was doing its slow collapse into dark, the sky above the mountains going from blue to something deeper, and the first stars were coming visible above the ridgeline. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. I know you know, he said. I wanted to say it anyway, out loud, without the in-my-own-way version of it. She picked up the pendant again and held it. When I got on that train in December, she said, I told myself it was a practical decision, that I was going somewhere I could be useful and have a situation and not be dependent on anyone's charity. That was all true. I believed it completely. She turned the pendant in her fingers. I didn't let myself think about anything else because I'd already been in one marriage where wanting more than what was there had just made the loneliness worse. I'd learned to want less. I thought that was wisdom. It wasn't? He said. It was survival, she said. It's not the same thing. He waited. I love you too, she said. She said it plainly, the way she said things that were true, without dressing them up, without hedging. I've been loving you since about February and trying to decide if it was safe to know that. Is it? He said. She looked at him directly. Yes, she said. I think it is. He reached across the table and she put the pendant down and took his hand, and they held that for a moment. His damaged hand in both of hers, the way she'd held it that first night after the poultice, except that this time nothing needed fixing. Balchek, there are things you can't understand about a life until you've lived far enough into it. When Caleb was younger, 28, 30, the years when he was building the ranch and the marriage and everything that felt like the future, he thought he knew what the important things were. Land, cattle, a good woman beside you, and children coming. He was right, as far as that went. Those things were important. But he'd understood them the way you understand anything when you're too close to it, as individual things, separate, each with its own weight. What he understood now, at 53, was that none of them meant what they meant alone. The land was just land without someone to bring you coffee when you came in from it. The cattle were just cattle without someone to argue about them with. The long winters were just weather without someone whose sleeping sounds you knew in the dark, whose voice had become as much a part of the place as the creek sound and the wind. He hadn't known that when he was younger. He'd thought the things themselves were the point. He'd needed another 50 years and the loss of almost everything and a mail-order arrangement with a 56-year-old widow from Oregon to understand that the things were never the point. The people were the point. The being with was the point. Everything else was just the work you did in between. Margaret understood this already. She'd understood it the hard way, through 23 years of having the people wrong. She'd come west, not because she believed things would be different, but because she needed a different situation. And she'd been careful and practical and clear-eyed about what she was stepping into. What she hadn't planned on, what neither of them had planned on, was that careful and practical and clear-eyed turns out to be a reasonable foundation for something that grows into more than that, if you give it time and honesty and the willingness to be known. That was the thing nobody told you. Or maybe people tried to tell you and you weren't listening because you were 28 and building your future and didn't think you needed the instruction. Love. The kind that holds over decades and hard winters and loss and the grinding daily work of keeping something alive. That kind isn't built from intensity, it's built from accumulation. From all the ordinary moments that don't look like anything when they're happening. The coffee left by the chair, the curtains hung level. The fence argument you were wrong about. The hand held at the table when someone tells you the hard thing. The green slope seen from a ridge on the first warm morning of spring. None of it was dramatic. All of it was real. The pendant became a thing she wore most days. Not always, not formally, just the way you wear something that means something when there's no reason not to. He saw it when she was in the garden, when she was at the table, when she was up on the porch in the mornings before he came out, sitting with her coffee and looking at the mountains the way she'd started doing since the weather turned. One morning in October, he came out and found her there, and he got his own coffee and sat down beside her, and they looked at the mountains together in the cold morning air. The aspens on the high slopes were full gold now, the color so dense and solid it looked painted, and the peaks above them had their first snow of the season, thin still, just a dusting on the upper ridges. Below, the valley was still green and brown in the last of the fall, and the cattle were visible in the far pasture, small dark shapes moving slowly through the morning. "I want to tell you something," Margaret said. "Tell me," he said. "When I got off that train in December," she said, "and I saw you standing there, you looked like a man who'd rather be anywhere else." He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't anywhere else," he said. "No," she said, "you weren't." He looked at the mountains. "You looked like a woman who'd walked off a train into a situation she'd assessed completely and was deciding whether it was acceptable," he said. She made a sound that was approximately a laugh. "That's exactly what I was doing." "What did you decide?" "I decided it was workable," she said. He turned to look at her. She was looking at the mountains, the pendant visible at her collar, her silver hair loose in the morning the way it was before she put it up. "And now?" he said. She turned to look at him. Her expression was the simple one, the one she had more often now, the one where the complicated layers had settled into something cleaner because she wasn't holding as much back. "Now it's home," she said. He reached over and took her hand where it sat on the arm of the chair. She turned it and held his. They sat like that in the cold October morning, looking at the mountains and the cattle and the valley they were responsible for. Two people who had come to each other late and sideways, and for all the wrong reasons, and had managed, against most reasonable expectation, to build something that would hold. The winter that came that year was no easier than the one before. The snow came heavy in November, and the temperatures dropped in December to the bone-deep kind that made the nails in the walls contract and pop in the night. The cattle needed more tending. The wood needed constant replenishing. The well rope froze twice, and Caleb replaced it with a heavier braid that Margaret held the lantern for in the dark, her breath making clouds, not complaining. But the cabin was warm in a way it hadn't been for 11 years. Not just the wood stove kind of warm, though that was there, the other kind. The kind that comes from two people moving through the same space with the accumulated ease of people who have learned each other, who have had the arguments and the silences and the hard conversations, and are still there. On a night in January, when the storm was the worst it had been all season, and there was nothing to do but stay inside and wait, they played cards by the lamp. Margaret was winning, which was her default state at cards, a fact Caleb had made his peace with. "You cheat," he said. "I don't cheat," she said. "I pay attention. There's a difference." "Remind me what the difference is." "Cheating requires deception," she said, laying down her cards. "Paying attention just requires watching." He looked at his cards and then at her. "What do you see when you watch?" he said. She looked at him across the table. The lamp was between them and the fire was going, and outside the storm was doing what Montana storms do, which is to remind you how small you are and how important it is to be inside with good walls and someone worth being inside with. Everything, she said. I see everything. He set down his cards. He reached over and turned the lamp down a little, and they sat in the quieter light and listened to the storm and let it be what it was. There's a thing that happens in a life if you're patient and honest and willing to stay when staying is hard. Not always, not guaranteed, but possible. The empty places fill. Not the way they were before, not with the same things or the same people, because those things and those people were their own and can't be replaced and shouldn't be. But filled with new things, different things, things you couldn't have anticipated from where you were standing when the emptiness was all you could see. Caleb Voss had stood in that emptiness for 11 years. He'd gotten good at it. He told himself it was sufficient, that a man his age and his situation had had his portion and the rest was just endurance. He hadn't been wrong exactly. He'd just been looking at a closed door and calling it a wall. Margaret Ellison had gotten on a train with one suitcase and no particular hope beyond the practical, and she'd walked through the door that Caleb didn't know was still there, and she'd fixed the curtains and organized the shelf and tended his hand and faced down a company of land fraudsters on a train platform and told him the hardest things about herself by lamplight. And somewhere in all of that, gradually and then all at once, the way he'd described it to her, the empty ranch had become a home again. Not a perfect one. Never that. The arguments still happened, and the hard seasons still came, and there were mornings when the work was brutal and the weather was against them, and they were both short-tempered and worn. The damage they each carried from before didn't disappear. The losses didn't unloose. The years of loneliness didn't unhappen. The things that had been said to Margaret in her first marriage left marks that would always be there, that she'd always have to know were there. But you don't need a perfect life. You need a true one. You need someone who sees you clearly and stays anyway, who knows your actual dimensions instead of a version of you that's been adjusted for their comfort. You need to be in a place that knows your name, that holds the accumulation of your ordinary days and gives them somewhere to be. Margaret had found that in a cold cabin on a Montana mountain with a man who'd forgotten he still had room for it. Caleb had found it in a woman who'd stepped off a train carrying one suitcase and more quiet courage than he'd understood at first glance. That was the whole of it. That was enough. Outside, the January storm went on pressing against the walls the way winter always does, testing what's been built, looking for the weakness. The walls held. The fire burned. The lamp gave it steady light. And in the cabin on the eastern slope of the Bitterroot Range, in the small warm room that smelled of herbs and coffee and pine smoke, two people who had arrived at each other by accident and necessity, and had chosen, slowly and with open eyes, to stay. Two people sat in the quiet dark and listened to the storm, and were not afraid of it.